Welcome everyone to the eighth installment of Seedy Talks. Today I have the honor to host Dr. Elizabeth Hoover as our speaker, who's joining us from California. Uh, Dr. Elizabeth Hoover is an associate professor in the Environmental Science Policy and Management Department at the University of California, Berkeley, whose research, life, and community work focuses on food sovereignty and environmental justice for Native American communities. Based on collaborations with tribal communities across the US, Hoover has published books and articles about Native American food sovereignty and seed rematriation, environmental reproductive justice in Native American communities, and tribal citizen science and community-based participatory research. Just as a quick reminder, this lecture will be recorded. Please remain muted throughout the lecture. Once Dr. Hoover is done speaking, we will have a question and answer session. So in the chat box, towards the end of the presentation, please enter your questions in the chat box as Dr. Hoover ends her lecture, so that I can take notes and ask the questions. Before I turn it over to Dr. Hoover, I'd like to thank once again our community members who make this event special. Looking at my attendee list, I see many familiar names in our in the list for today, and also some new ones. Specifically, our community members from 25 counties across West Virginia is here today with us, in addition to people from 12 states across the country, as well as Canada, Japan, Paraguay, and Turkey. Okay, Dr. Hoover, the stage is yours.
Hi, my name is Professor Elizabeth Hoover. I work in the Environmental Science Policy Management Department at UC Berkeley, and I'm going to be presenting today about Native American food and seed sovereignty. So to start off with some definitions of food sovereignty, which is an important part of seed sovereignty. One of the more common definitions that people utilize was developed by La Via Campesina, which is an organization internationally of different land-based people around the world who are fighting for food sovereignty. And they define it as the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. Now, this is seen as a little bit different from food security, which is seen as consistently getting enough calories. So do you have access to even enough food aid that will help you to get enough to eat? And then on top of that, the food justice movement said, okay, we need to not just have enough access to enough calories, but making sure that people have access to safe and healthy food, that there are assurances that workers within the food system are treated fairly, and also making sure that we're accounting for the value of food in relation to the self-determination of communities. So giving communities a bit more control over what they're eating and where it's coming from. And then taking that a step further, the food sovereignty movement says, okay, we need to not just have equality within the current system, but making sure that people have control over their own system. So developing a food system that's independent of this system that many others are part of. And then on top of that, people think about Indigenous food sovereignty in particular, and saying on top of that, the rest of those definitions, we need to make sure that we're recognizing the social, cultural, and economic relationships that underlie community food sharing and that need to be nurtured, and also that the sacred responsibilities to nurture those relationships to land-based food and political systems. So recognizing that as sovereign nations, tribal nations have these land-based foods and political systems that need to be respected and included as part of food sovereignty. So this is kind of the whirlwind tour of settler colonialism in North America. Some of the challenges to Indigenous food and seed systems. So thinking about why is it that Native communities today are working so hard to reclaim food sovereignty? In many cases, it started, especially on the East Coast where I came from, with these scorched earth battle tactics. So for Haudenosaunee people, the French came through in the 17th century, and when they were not getting along with Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people, set fire to cornfields in order to disrupt the food systems and politically weaken people. And George Washington followed on this technique when he sent General Sullivan in the 1790s to lay waste to their settlement, referring to Haudenosaunee people who had not joined with the Americans who were actively taking over their land. And so as punishment, they set fire to millions of bushels of corn and acres of corn, beans, and squash and fruit trees and other food production technologies. And so, but thereby trying to weaken these communities politically so that they would have to negotiate with the American government. Similarly, for Navajo people who were forced on the Long Walk in the 1860s, people who did not join that forced march up to the concentration camp that was Bosque Redondo, Kit Carson and his men would set fire to their fields, to their orchards, to their crops of sheep. There was also outright theft of land and forced relocation of tribal communities. So, one of the most well-known being the Trail of Tears, in which Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole Creek people were marched by the tens of thousands from the southeastern part of the country to Oklahoma. And as part of that, if you've been to, say, North Carolina and you've been to Oklahoma, you know that the climates are very different. It's different plants that grow there. It's different animals. So this really impacted people's ability to be able to feed themselves by not having access to the same climates and plants and animals that they were used to. The Allotment Act, or the Dawes Act in 1887, also impacted people's ability to hang on to land bases that were already smaller than they had traditionally been. So the Dawes Act took communally held land on reservations and broke it into individual parcels. And then the extra land that was left over after those individual parcels were doled out was sold to settlers. And so that then continued to shrink the land bases that Native people could use in order to feed their communities. You also had the boarding schools, which were set up intentionally to assimilate Native youth to Western society. The whole quote about we're going to kill the Indian to save the man. So kids were forcibly taken from their homes for years on end, and in these boarding schools taught new language, new food ways, new ways of growing food that were more in line with Western farming rather than the traditional ways of food production that they were used to. The Bureau of Indian Affairs also pushed Western farming methods and seeds on communities, even if they had already been farming for thousands of years. So for example, in the Southwest, Hopi and Pueblo people have been dryland farming for eons. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs came and said, oh no, you need to do irrigation and you need to use these hybrid seeds. And then irrigation led to oversalination of the soil, and the hybrid seeds meant that people couldn't save them year after year. And then it was like, oh, well, maybe that system you had before was working better than this one we pushed on you. But by then, everybody, the land tenure system had been all screwed up, and it was challenging to reinstate some of those traditional methods of farming. I'll talk a little bit about, at the same time that Native farmers were being told to take on other kinds of hybrid seeds, traditional seeds were being collected by non-Native collectors, seed breeders, and ag companies to put into catalogs and to create these kinds of hybrid seeds. Some of the current challenges, climate change is impacting, every single person who's trying to grow food, procure food, eat food. So that has made maintaining some of these heirloom varieties a little bit challenging in some places. People have concerns about cross-contamination with genetically modified seeds. So if you have your field of heirloom seeds and your neighbor is planting a lot of, pioneer commodity corn, there's concerns about those genes mixing with your seeds and making it difficult to save seeds. And for some tribal communities, a lack of access to land and tools and seed make it difficult to revitalize some of these food systems. All right, so what have been some of the impacts of these kinds of altered food systems? Prior to 1940, there were very few cases of type 2 diabetes in Native communities, and now it's the 7th leading cause of death for Native people. The death rate because of diabetes is 249% greater for Native people than for other Americans, according to the U.S. Indian Health Service. And there are also economic impacts. So the White Earth Land Recovery Project did a survey with their community a few years back and found that people spent $8 million a year on food, $7 million of which was spent off reservation. So they said, okay, we need to figure out how do we keep these food dollars, in the community rather than it all going out to people outside of the community. All right, so that was the grim, depressing portion of today's programming. So I don't want to wallow in the grim details, but I think it's important to set up some of the historic base for why people are working as hard as they are or needing to work as hard as they are to revitalize some of these food systems. But essentially, Native people are not just laying around lamenting the loss of food and dying and starving, right? People are working very hard to think about how do you revitalize some of these food systems? How do you bring back and support and maintain some of these heirloom seeds? And so I started thinking about this topic in particular while working with this organization, Ganahio Ngwaya Dohage, or We Are Planting Good Seeds, which is a group of folks in the Mohawk community of Akwesasne who have been working to try to get people back into farming and gardening and seed saving and harvesting their own food after dealing with issues of environmental contamination and other factors that led this community from being very self-reliant on themselves for food production. And within the last generation or two, most people now buying their food. So Ganahio has been working to try to get heirloom seeds back into people's hands, and for people who might not have the tools or the skills of the land to share space as part of a community garden project. So in working with these folks for the last, I'm gonna say about 15 years or so, there's been a lot of conversations about, how do other communities do this kind of work? How do people get funding? How do people get youth involved? And so as part of figuring this out, I decided to go visit a bunch of these other communities to see how are people doing this work. So in the summer of 2014, I did a 20,000-mile road trip around the country. I had been meeting a lot of different people at different food sovereignty summits, and I decided to go visit them in person on their farms and at their garden projects. So I went to 39 different Native community-based farming and gardening projects and recorded 52 kind of formal sit-down interviews with people, and then recorded 34 farm tours. I also conducted interviews with 30 different Native seed keepers who are working to preserve and revitalize some of these Native seeds, and then went and talked to chefs. And I'll speak very briefly at the end, kind of what is the role of chefs in getting people excited about preserving these seeds, eating these seeds, growing these seeds, because otherwise you're just sort of collecting them and they look lovely in jars, but how do you get people excited about eating them? So somebody had to do the hard work of going to all these different dinners and visiting with chefs, right? It's a tough job. Somebody's got to do it. And then I won't talk about this as much, but also talk to people who are part of anti-pipeline, anti-mining work, because it's hard to preserve traditional foods if the landscape you're looking to grow them on is threatened by pipeline development. So some of the questions I was asking different Native farmers were about, what were their successes and challenges? Who were they hoping to work with? How do they define food sovereignty? How do you define what qualifies as an Indigenous seed, heritage, heirloom seed? Where do you get your funding? Is there funding that you won't pursue or accept? And this is always challenging, right? And figuring out how to fund community-based nonprofit work. Some people say you live by the grant, you die by the grant, but it's also kind of challenging sometimes to become financially self-sufficient if you're working to try to get food out to as many people as possible who may not have a lot of money to buy your food. But with that in mind, was there funding that people would rather not go after? And for some people, it was like, you know what, how do you decolonize if you're going to the government who colonized you for funding? So no, we're not going to let them put their stamp on our project. And other people were like, I will take your dirty Walmart money and I will plant a lot of food for my community, and there is no clean money, so it doesn't matter. So there was a real range of thoughts around, how does funding fit into this? And then, do you see yourself as part of this broader food movement? And what recommendations do you have for other communities trying to start a project like yours? And so I have a book project that I'm really trying to finish up by the end of this month or the next that will address all of these different topics. So because book projects take a heck of a long time, as do articles, I started this blog, from Garden Warriors to Good Seeds, because people were like, well, I would like to just go visiting all over creation and see what other farms are up to, but somebody has to stay here and pull the weeds, right? So the blog was a way for people to be able to see what each other was working on, and for people to have some web exposure in some spaces. So, one of the first questions I asked people was, how do you define food sovereignty? So this is a term that activists and academics love and throw around a lot, but what did it mean to people who were working in these different projects on the ground? So this is an article that I wrote that I'm happy to send people because it's behind a paywall, unfortunately. So I am happy to just send you the PDF if you shoot me an email at the end, and then you don't have to pay the $30 to read it. But essentially, when I asked people, how are you defining food sovereignty, their answers were really centered on these factors here. So there's a real focus on the restoration of physical, cultural, and spiritual health. So, I mentioned some of those grim health statistics earlier. So getting healthy people food out to people so that they could avoid some of those different metabolic disorders, but also recognizing that cultural and spiritual health are connected to being able to redevelop connections with these seeds and having these foods at ceremonies. And so along those lines, having culturally appropriate foods available to the community. You can't just go to any store and buy some of this. This is Kenny holding Mohawk red bread corn, or some Pueblo folks talked about specific corns that they needed for their ceremonies. So are the culturally appropriate foods available to the community? Really reinforcing the relationship between people and each other, between people and the land, and people and these food communities. Thinking about individual, community, and tribal self-sufficiency and control of the food system. So to what extent do individuals have responsibility and control over what they're putting in their own mouths? Is your community taken care of as far as everybody having access to these foods? And what is the role of tribal government in passing policies that help support farmers and help support traditional food production? Looking to be more economically independent. So I mentioned earlier that survey that the White Earth Land Recovery Project did. How do you keep those food dollars within the community and supporting people who are producing these foods? Making sure everyone has access to the foods. There was a big focus on education. So making sure that you weren't just getting the food to people, but that people had a good sense of, why they should be eating what they should be eating, and knowing more about where their food comes from, and thinking about food sovereignty not as this final destination, like, oh, ta-da, we have achieved 100% food sovereignty, but instead thinking about food sovereignty as a movement, as a process that people are working towards, and as a method through which we can think about these topics. So because I was focusing specifically on farming and gardening projects. So the native food sovereignty movement is much bigger than that, right? There are some people who are working on fishing rights and gathering and foraging and hunting rights, whaling. There's a lot of different ways that people are revitalizing food systems, but I had to put some kind of boundaries around it, or I would still be on this road trip this many years later, visiting food projects, which would be fine, except that I had to get a job and support myself. So I had to pay for the gas to go in that car, right? So I focused specifically on farming and gardening projects because that's what I grew up doing and that's what I was familiar with. And because I was focused on farming and gardening projects, Heirloom Seeds came to be an important topic that people were working towards. So wanting to not just, go and buy your seed packets every spring. It's fun to look through seed catalogs and be like, oh, what are we going to put in the ground this year? but also teaching people how to save their own seeds and become independent in that way, and focusing on seeds that were developed specifically, by their ancestors for their climate and their community. So some of these seeds, I talk about in the chapter I'm working on seed sovereignty, people reckon have just always been there. So the Coach to Youth Enrichment Project partners youth with farmers in the community to learn about farming. So the youth kind of shadow the farmers and learn about growing. And Jason introduced me to his grandma Percy, and she has all these amazing corns that were just like all over the house. They were on every layer of the house, all these beautiful corns. And he said, we've always just had these seeds. So for these kinds of corns, it wasn't necessarily a process of hunting them down and bringing them home. In other cases, seeds have gone off on these wild adventures and then been reunited with their communities more recently. So this is an example where that's Rowan White in the red shawl. She was the chair of the board for the Seed Savers Exchange in Decorah, Iowa. And she has a lot of roles, but I'm going to talk about that hat in particular that she's wearing here. And as part of that, she went through the lists of all the different seeds that they have there and said, how can we reunite Native communities with some of these seeds that have been collected from Native people and have now been stored here? And one of these was this Taos squash that you can see Tiana cradling here, and these other ladies, Henrietta and these other Lynns. So they grew that out in Decorah, and then as part of this food sovereignty symposium that was hosted at Taos, Rowan had the squash shipped there. It got there just in time for the last day of the symposium. And people, nobody had grown the squash for 70 years in this community. And people, you could see them cradling it like a baby. It was welcomed home like this kind of lost and wandering relative that had been returned home. So there's been efforts for seeds that have kind of gone off on these adventures and no one's growing anymore, tracking them down and bringing them home. And so when I ask people, why is it important to plant and save heritage seeds instead of just, ordering out of catalog, which is much easier, some people would say. And, some of the answers pointed to establishing a cultural connection to planting. So for the Dream of Wild Health project, you see some corn wearing its little hats up here in the upper right-hand corner. It was important. This project is a bit north of Minneapolis in Minnesota. They said, well, we wanted to reunite Dakota corn with this Dakota land here. And for the youth who are the garden warriors, they call them, working this land, to be able to reconnect on a cultural level with planting. So not just planting, arugula and beets, even though some of those go in the ground too, but also connecting with these culturally important plants. The ceremonial context in which many of these seeds are needed, having particular foods for ceremony, connecting seeds to the land that they were originally developed for, again, in the case of this Dakota corn being reunited with its homeland, and reestablishing connections to ancestors. So the idea that this handful of corn here, when you're holding this corn, you're connected to the decisions made by generations of seed keepers before you. So every grandma who decided at the end of each season which corn gets kept as seed and which goes into the soup pot contributes to that corn that you're holding now. So you're able to connect with those ancestors through having those seeds. These varieties were seen as more nutritious in many cases than hybrid conventional varieties, and to try to develop an independence from industrial agriculture, to know that you have your own seeds sitting on the shelf. And if there's some kind of seed shortage like we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, that's not going to impact you if you have your own collection of seeds. And so some scholars have written about this, thinking about heirloom crops and memory and how that plays into people's desire to want to reunite with some of these crops. Virginia Nazaria is an anthropologist who looks at seeds, and she talks about the reattachment of stories and memories to food being important for biodiversity, and how heirloom crops play a central role in the restoration of these landscapes of remembrance. And then sociologist Jennifer Jordan talks about edible memory, so infusing food with connections to the past, both deeply personal and inherently social, and how food has this unique quality to carry personal and social meanings. So, we think about even calling them heirloom seeds, when you're passing on an heirloom, family heirloom from one member to another. People in passing on these heirloom seeds are passing on the genotypes, but also It's about consuming other people's memories and other people's preferences and being connected to those people. And along those lines, Alison Landsberg talks about prosthetic memories. So in some cases, the visceral experience of memories that aren't your own. And I have a picture here of Deb Echo Hawk, who runs the Pawnee Seed Project. And the Pawnee were relocated from Nebraska down to Oklahoma. They lost a lot of their traditional seed varieties as part of that process. And Deb wanted to reunite her community she wanted to track down some of those kind of lost relatives and bring them home and reconnect her community with that. She said, okay, well, we're making corn soup for our ceremonies. I want that to be made out of the corn that our ancestors made this soup out of. So, she spent years kind of going and visiting people, seeing who had seeds. There was a bundle that was repatriated to the community that had seeds as part of it, that she worked with farmers in Nebraska to get it to sprout, because that was the soil it wanted to be in. It wasn't quite ready to grow in Oklahoma just yet. And so she worked for years without having known how these corns tasted. She still dedicated years to growing them out until they had enough seed to finally have corn in their corn soup. And she was telling a group of folks gathered for the Indigenous Farming Conference how that first year she didn't even get a bite. It went so fast. So it took a little more work and a little more growing out. But to work that hard for a food that you don't know what it tastes like yet, but you have this sort of prosthetic memory knowing that your ancestors found it that important. So seed sovereignty more broadly, as defined through folks like Jack Kloppenberg, like Vandana Shiva, who've worked very hard on this topic, is the rights of farmers to save, use, exchange, and, if their community is okay with it, sell their farm-raised seed, and having that be valued over the plant breeders and agrochemical firms' intellectual property rights. So there's been a real tension, for eons around the world. People got their seed by saving it themselves, by trading it with other farmers and gardeners that they used, exchanging it, bartering it. And it's only recently that now these intellectual property rights have made that challenging, have made it so that some seeds can't be traded and exchanged and sold. So that's been an inherent tension between agrochemical firms and other kinds of farmers, gardeners, seed savers. And so when I asked some of the native seed keepers that I was visiting with how they would define seed sovereignty, this is Clayton Bracope here that you see with a handful of corn, who founded the Traditional Native American Farmers Association in the 90s. And he said that, he defines seed sovereignty as protecting our living relatives so they can't be molested, contaminated, or imprisoned. And he said, okay, what I mean by molested is if somebody, takes your heirloom seed, takes your community seed, and picks it apart on a cellular level in their lab, and takes out, some genes and puts in other genes, that felt like a violation of that relative, that was the kind of equivalent of molesting that relative. Contaminated, as I mentioned, there's been a challenge for some people growing out heirloom seeds, that if your fields are located next to people who are growing other kinds of corn, especially because corn pollen travels so easily, your crops could be contaminated. And he said, what I mean by imprisoned is if somebody decides to patent your seeds, then they own your seeds, they keep your seeds, and it's harder for you to exchange them, trade them, sell them, if that's what your community wants to do. So he sees it as seed sovereignty is the inherent right to save seed and pass it on to future generations. And then Rowan White, who I introduced earlier, who also helped to found the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, talks about native seed sovereignty as being able to define our relationship to that seed based on our own values and not on the values of anyone outside of our community. So there have been different community efforts to protect Indigenous seeds and keep them within the community. So Tesuque Pueblo has an amazing seed bank that they built that's a cob building. So inside those nice thick adobe walls are straw bales, or in the lower level is tires, which I thought was a great reuse of tires, because many communities, those kind of build up where people dump them, and they've used them as a building material here. And then the Jijak Foundation at the Gunwale Lake Potawatomi, here's another example of a community seed bank where people can go store their seeds, kind of get seeds to be able to grow. The Indigenous Seed Keepers Network is a program under the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, of which I'm a board member. And the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network has been working to support communities who want to know more about growing out and saving for seed. So, for the seed keepers on this call here, that it's a different level of farming if you are farming to save your seed at the end of the season than it is if you're just growing for vegetables to eat, right? You have to know what can be planted near each other, what can't, when should things be harvested in order to save for seed. So Rowan and colleagues led, bunches and bunches of workshops all over the country with different communities in order to help, this train the trainer model to be able to pass on this information. Things like this hand pollination workshop, they've developed a seed sovereignty assessment toolkit to help communities figure out, okay, what seeds are here, what do people have, and what seeds are people kind of looking to track down and bring home. And then back when we used to have all these fabulous in-person gatherings, there'd be a lot of seed exchanges as part of that, right? To be able to share seed from one farmer and gardener to the next. And then this is the seed packet that was developed by the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network that includes a little clause on the tab, kind of like their own bag tag that says, like, look, if you're opening this packet and using these seeds, you're committing to not abuse them or patent them or treat them strangely in any way. Because there's been this history, right, of native seeds being collected and then kind of used as the collectors and settler society saw fit, right? So Oscar Will traveled around, especially the upper Midwest and the plains. In the 1884 is when he started selling seeds. So he would, and you can see the iconography that is used as part of the advertising for these. It's like, oh, look, here's some native people giving away their corn. Again, this is the same time that then, not that long after, people would be encouraged not to be growing their heirloom seeds, but to be buying the hybridized versions of these. At the Field Museum, and I'll talk about that example a little more in a bit, seeds were collected by anthropologists as like, oh, isn't this interesting, a token of disappearing cultures? So William Jones was collecting seeds in the early 1900s. And then the Science Museum of Minnesota, which was also part of a seed rematriation project I'll talk about, Wesley Hiller, who was a dentist / anthropologist, because apparently guys could have all the jobs in the 1930s. He was traveling around also collecting seeds. Again, it's sort of an interesting token of like, oh, look what these people are up to. So seed rematriation is a term that I've brought up a few times in this talk here. And the idea is, so people have probably heard of the term repatriation. It's often used in the context of prisoners of war who are repatriated to their home country, or under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, ancestral remains, sacred objects, objects of cultural patrimony that are taken from institutions that receive federal funding and sent back to their tribal nations that they were taken from. So it's kind of this one-way arrow, right? It's sending something home that shouldn't have been taken to begin with. So the term rematriation was developed, because it sounds less patriarchal, right? So you're recognizing the important role that women have played in seed keeping over millennia, but also thinking about this more circular process. So reconnecting Indigenous people to seeds that have been taken outside the community, reconnecting those seeds back to the motherland for which they were developed, and in the process, connecting Indigenous people to land. So a few seed rematriation projects that have been going on. I already talked a little bit about the project between the Seed Savers Exchange and Taos Pueblo. They're also growing out seeds that are being returned to other Native communities around the country as well. I mentioned the Pawnee Seed Preservation Project. So that's Deb Echohawk with Ronnie O'Brien, who's a farmer she's been collaborating with in Nebraska, again, to grow out seeds that were developed for Nebraska that were a little resistant to try to sprout in Oklahoma. And now they've grown out enough seeds that they're growing some out in Oklahoma, kind of gradually getting that heirloom seed adapted to its new home. The Science Museum of Minnesota, as I mentioned, Wesley Hiller was collecting seeds and they were donated to the museum. And then a few years back, they decided to try sprouting some of those seeds and reconnecting them with the communities they had been originally collected from. So the Dakota flint corn that was a few slides back came from this collection that was then sprouted and grown out. The University of Michigan is working with MACPRA, which is an organization of tribes, to establish a garden on campus to eventually be growing out some of the seeds that are part of the campus museum's collections at the botanical garden. The Mohawks have been, of Akwesasne and other Haudenosaunee nations have been collaborating with the Hudson Valley Farm Hub and the Native Seed Sanctuary, which is land that Haudenosaunee people would have been growing on, except that settlers took it all over and drove everybody north a few hundred years ago. So it's reconnecting people to land. One of the first corns that they grew out there is this Mohawk red bread corn that you can sort of see a faded photo in the background of. And this was a seed that came down to really just a few cobs left in the world that Mohawk seed keeper Steve McCumber had, and he grew some out and then gave seed to this project. And then, a couple 100 pounds of corn was sent back to the community after the first year of growing. And then this project down in the middle here, the Ponca corn grown on the Keystone XL pipeline. So in 1877, Ponca people were relocated from this area of Nebraska forcibly by soldiers to move down to Oklahoma. They had already planted their corn when they were rounded up and sent down there, so they didn't get the chance to take seeds with them. This is Amos Hinton, who a few years back, when he was the director of the agricultural program, wanted to track down some of these corns that he had read that his ancestors used to grow that people didn't have anymore. So he spent a lot of time reaching out to people like Deb Echohawk, who had been working to reconnect with seeds. He also, through a corn breeder, was connected with a Dakota woman whose family had a corn that's, they theorize they may have harvested from this space generations back and then stewarded within their own families. But he worked very hard to get these corns back and, working with the seed breeder, growing out until they had corn that looked the way it did when his ancestors were growing it. And so when the Keystone Pipeline was slated to come through this part of Nebraska, farmers and ranchers and Native people teamed up to fight against that pipeline coming through. And as another kind of symbol of you shall not pass through here, they took some of that corn that had been working for years on having returned to the community and planted it together in this field, and have been planting it there every spring since this photo was taken in May of 2014. And then the Tanderup family ended up deeding this cornfield to the Ponca tribe of Oklahoma and the Ponca tribe of Nebraska. So then the pipeline would have to go through another series of landowners and have to go through another round of regulation. And as of right now, the Keystone Pipeline has been canceled. We shall see. The fate of pipelines has been kind of up and down. But this is one way that these heirloom seeds were used to kind of stand in the way of that project. And then at the Field Museum, as I mentioned, an anthropologist collected seeds in 1907. And he wasn't just any anthropologist. This was William Jones, who was the first Native guy to get a PhD in anthropology. He was Sac and Fox from Oklahoma, and he started working for the Field Museum, and they sent him to Meskwaki settlement in Iowa to collect objects from this community. And as part of that, he decided to collect some seeds that they were growing. And you can see in Luke's hands in the bottom left-hand corner here, he wrote these little notes in the Meskwaki language on slips of paper and stuck it in with each of the batches of seeds. For his next mission, he was sent off to the Philippines to collect from the Ilongot headhunters, as they were called, and he got into a disagreement with one and was stabbed to death. So that was the short career of the first Native anthropologist guy. So this collection just sort of sat there in the museum for a long time. And when they asked me to be on an advisory committee to revamp the Native North America Hall, I said yes, because I knew they had all of these seeds in the collection. And when I first got there, they were like, look, lady, this is not a seed bank. Like, what do you mean you want to come see the seeds? I said, no, hear me out. And so after many discussions, we brought some representatives from the Meskwaki tribe up to revisit with these seeds that hadn't had any relatives visiting with them in 100 years. And then some of those seeds were packaged up and sent down to the Meskwaki Tribal Museum. And they haven't sprouted yet. I mean, they're 100 years old and they were not kept in seed bank conditions. So I'm not sure if they will end up sprouting. The hope is maybe they will. But aside from that, what this has done is to develop a different kind of relationship between the field museum staff, and the folks in Meskwaki who had seen the museum as not that collaborative prior to this point. They've had a lot of struggles in getting things repatriated there. So staff from the Field Museum came down and visited the Meskwaki community, got to see some of the contemporary garden projects. There was a big feast for everybody, and then came back again for the powwow to, like these ladies are doing the bean dance. So to learn more about, how these varieties, how these seeds fit into broader Meskwaki culture. And it's going to be part of the exhibit that's going up. So thinking about how can museums develop a different kind of relationships with Native communities, especially around their seed collections. So when I got to Berkeley, I was like, hey, Hearst Museum, what you got? And here we have a new faculty director who was like, yeah, let's have a look. Let's see what's in the collections. And so, we've been going through the catalog, seeing, what are the seeds? George Carter is this guy who collected a lot of different seeds, especially from the Southwest. So we've been compiling lists and starting to reach out to communities to say, hey, are there any seeds here that you're interested in being reconnected with? And thinking about, again, how do museums develop different kinds of relationships with the communities whose objects they're holding? And then the Indigenous Community Learning Garden is something that we have been working on as well, space on campus for especially the Indigenous students to start learning about both wild plants and California native local plants, but also growing plants out. And there's a chance maybe some of these, if a community is interested in having some of these seeds grown out, that might take place here at the Learning Garden. So kind of getting toward wrapping up, as I mentioned, people can grow out all of these seeds, and you've seen all of the beautiful pictures of seeds. And what's really going to inspire people to want to continue growing them out is if they know how to cook them and are excited about cooking them and eating them. And so I've had the opportunity to visit with a lot of Native chefs. The bottom right-hand corner, this is Cafe Aloni, who we're hoping to this spring have reestablished at the Hearst Museum. So being able to, again, get the museum involved in more food issues. As well as this is Chef Tanya Brandt with her sister talking about how some of these foods fit into Haudenosaunee diplomacy and the treaties that people have had. And then Chef Sean Sherman here, whose restaurant, if anybody's in the Minneapolis area, opened recently, who's made a career out of focusing on ingredients from the Western Hemisphere in particular, so cooking with just native foods. So the work that chefs have been doing in defining and creating traditional food, so expanding beyond just what people think of as like stews and roast meats, but also creating beautiful artistic foods with native ingredients and working to get people excited about eating these revitalized heirloom varieties. So these little biscuity looking things here are cakes made out of sunflower seeds and the red bread corn that you've been seeing in the background. And this is an heirloom squash that's been shredded on top. So the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance has been hosting a culinary program as part of that, where chefs can come together at these food sovereignty summits and learn some of these techniques from each other. So this is Ho-Chunk chef Elena Terry, who really loves squash, all kinds of heirloom squash, and has created a lot of beautiful recipes. And then, dinners like this iCollective dinner here, where a group of chefs has come together on different occasions to make these beautiful meals and has used these heirloom seeds as a way of talking to people about history and politics. So the tepary beans under this dish here to talk about issues going on the border in the Tohono O'odham community where these seeds are coming from. So thinking about how these foods play into gastro diplomacy, right? And food studies scholars talk about gastro diplomacy as winning hearts and minds through stomachs. So how do you introduce a foreign culture or cuisine, through cuisine, which is seen as non-threatening? How do you get people interested in these issues through food? So enhancing cultural understanding and cultural visibility through these different meals. And so this is Quentin Glabus, who works with the I Collective, has talked about hosting, some of these uncomfortable conversations, getting people to think about racism in the food system and settler colonialism. So people come for this fancy meal, and then it's like, oh, by the way, here's this education you're going to get through each of these dishes. And I mentioned Cafe Ohlone. They, in addition to presenting these beautiful meals, talk about the history of Ohlone and other California Indian people. And they talk about feeding allies. So it's like, okay, now that you've sat and you've had this beautiful food with us and you've heard all about this history, you have an obligation going forward to correct people when you hear them saying incorrect things about our communities. So thinking about building allies through these beautiful meals. And then also just kind of wrapping up, think about how Indigenous food sovereignty has become this growing international movement. So Indigenous farmers from different places have started connecting with each other over these similar shared experiences. So these are photos I took from a corn conference that was in Tlaxcala, Mexico, in Vicente Guerrero, that was hosted by the Intertribal Indian Treaty Council and the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance and some other organizations that brought together Indigenous corn farmers from the US, Canada, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Guatemala, all these different folks coming together to talk about their similar corn issues. And then the photos to the left here are from the Uchbenka Corn Conference in 2020, right before everything got locked down. We had the chance to go to Belize, and there were Indigenous farmers from North America who got the opportunity to visit with Mayan farmers from Belize and Guatemala as part of this conference. So again, to kind of talk about some of the shared struggles and successes in maintaining these heirloom varieties. And then also thinking about how has COVID-19 impacted Indigenous food systems. So, many of you who are savers, seed keepers, probably got an inundation of requests that first spring when everybody panicked, when the grocery store shelves were empty because everybody freaked out and hoarded food. And then I was like, oh my God, we have to grow gardens or we're all going to starve. Where do we get the seeds? And then everybody hoarded and panicked and gathered up all the seeds. And so there was a real movement toward, okay, how do we use this as a teaching moment to say, yes, we do all need to be growing our own food in some way, but how do we also learn how to save seeds as part of this? So again, thinking about the lessons that have come out of how COVID-19 impacted the food system. So just wrapping up here, to summarize, heritage seeds are an integral part of agriculture, especially if we're thinking of the last half of that word there, and the health and resilience of communities, especially Indigenous communities, the importance of rematriation to seed sovereignty efforts, and how this work kind of goes into mending, creating, and restoring relationships between Indigenous community members and Indigenous communities and outside institutions. All right, so with that, I will stop sharing here. And it looks like lots of people have added comments and questions here. Oh, are you talking? You're on mute.
Would you like to take a break of a minute before we give people also time and you rest before they ask questions?
Sure, and I can.
All right. And I collected also some of the questions, and then please feel free to type your questions in the chat box. And we'll be back in a minute. All right. Paulo Fora from WVU Public Administration has a question. What do you think about the use of intellectual property for seeds by companies which highly affect farmers around the world, particularly native and traditional farmers?
Yeah, me just move this chat box here. The problem with the way the intellectual property system is structured here is that people take out a patent on a seed, on a trait of a seed even, and then an individual or one corporation owns that patent, and to the exclusion of everyone else, right? And I had the opportunity, so this became legal after the Supreme Court case in 1980 of Chakrabarty v. Diamond, right? So Chakrabarty was a scientist who wanted to patent a particular kind of bacterium that he had developed that would metabolize PCBs. And at the time, you couldn't patent living things. After the Supreme Court case, and yes, now you can patent living things. And I had the opportunity to chat with him real briefly when he came to Providence, where I used to work before coming out here to California. And I told him, I said, what do you think about, how this has developed since then, where people now are patenting these seeds and then going after farmers who may have inadvertently, even through pollen drift, gotten the pollen in their crops, or for indigenous communities who have said that the patenting goes against how they view how these seeds should be treated. And his only answer was, well, if people don't want their seeds to be patented, they should just patent them themselves, which really demonstrated a lack of understanding of what I was trying to get at here, in that people don't think that system works for how people are viewing these kinds of seeds. So it is problematic because of the way that, these communities oftentimes don't view seeds as the property of one person, that this seed variety is developed over generations, again, of people making particular decisions about how seeds are developed. And so I think that's where it's been challenging, is that people have concerns in some cases about even partnering with different life science departments because they're concerned that this could be a potential. So hopefully that answers.
Thank you very much.
The question.
Next question comes from Carrie Carpenter, professor of English and Native American Studies at WVU. When I was in grad school, I went to a talk by Wayne Deloria, and he talked about the rareness of grocery stores with adequate fresh produce on many reservations, and how that contributed to diabetes. Is this a part of your efforts?
So there have been, so for example, I would encourage you to have a look at the Navajo Nation has been working on policy work there, where they, the Dene Community Action Alliance, I think, Denisa Livingston is somebody who's been working on this a lot, where there the effort was to shift the tax system so that healthy food didn't have any tax on it, and that tax got shifted to foods that were deemed junk foods. And the money raised was to go toward exercise and programs to have more produce in stores. So there's been some challenges around that, but that's kind of one model of how people in communities are working to do that. I think that the folks who have done a really amazing job getting heirloom food into local grocery stores is the Oneida tribe in Wisconsin. The Junhinqua farm there grows a white corn that then the cannery washes, so they nixtamalize the corn and make it readily available for soup corn. They sell, packages of the ground cornmeal for corn flour that people can make cornbread out of and everything else, because often some of these traditional foods take a long time to process, and people are like, I just don't have time for that. And so by doing some of the processing there and then having them in the local store in the community and in some of the quick stops there, you can go fill up your gas for your car, go inside and grab a drink and get a package of mush at the same time. That makes it much more likely that people will eat more traditional foods. So I think those are some examples of what people are working on.
Next question comes from Milsa Dessa of Working Food, located in North Florida. It's a seed non-profit organization. I'll try to shorten it a little bit. And Melissa says that they tell the stories, share seed saving information, and encourage it. But no such amazing efforts like seed rematriation have been an opportunity they have found. We have great relationships with local Black chefs, farmers, and community leaders to share back the great African origin seeds we share, but no Indigenous community members. And I'm certain we have some Indigenous seeds I'd like to connect with. Melissa is asking how their organization can do better with any and all cultural seeds they steward.
Yeah, I mean, North Florida. I'm not that familiar with, I know there were different tribal communities in Florida, some of whom no longer exist in those kind of political bodies. And so, I don't know if I think it's worth researching, how your seeds came to be with your organization. Who were they with before they came to you? It could be those seeds that you guys are growing out there came from folks in other parts of the country. And it may be worth, paying homage when you're, growing and eating and selling these seeds to say, okay, this is a variety that initially came from, some of them they could come from anywhere, right? So they might have come from Europe as well through African-American farmers. And so, it could be that if there are any Indigenous roots to some of the seeds that you have, at least kind of giving a nod to the people who developed those seeds and helping people to think about and connect with those communities, I guess, in that way.
Next question is from Maral Errol of Humanities and Social Sciences Department at Işık University in Istanbul, Turkey. Maral says, I was wondering if there are any examples of heritage seeds or plant varieties that were traditionally grown by the indigenous communities but have been patented by the seed companies, or does it happen mostly as using them to create hybrid seeds?
In my experience, I think, there's been concerns about that. There have been seeds like beans from Mexico that were patented that people were resistant to. But I think now, I'm hearing from people who are kind of studying that, oh, here's this Seminole squash that genes are being extracted from to add to this other thing without having really consulted with the people who developed those initial varieties. So I know people are concerned about the potential of seeds being patented. I haven't heard of solid examples in North America of that happening, aside from kind of quiet, sneaky, taking genes from some things and adding them to others.
Bonnie Brown, director of WVU Native American Studies, WVU Native American Studies coordinator, wondering about efforts to decontaminate soil for planting purposes, given that so much soil throughout the Americas has suffered from industrial and agricultural contamination.
Yeah, in some areas, some projects, it's been about, adding soil on top, just sort of, I know there's been different like myco remediation experiments in different places. I couldn't speak to that specifically, but using fungus to decontaminate soil. A lot of times, people just don't necessarily have the resources for that, and it's just been containers that people have used in places where they're concerned about the quality of the soil. Especially some of the projects that I went to visit were in more urban spaces. And so it was about a lot of, kind of creating a barrier and then bringing in a lot of outside soil that people knew to be safe and then working in that way.
Rebecca Ivanov from Ontario has two questions. And the first question is, do you know of any writings about some of the ways that institutions are rematriating seeds? In particular, I'm curious about the support that institutions need to give and not just the seeds.
Yeah, we really need to get on writing this. So I'm working on a book chapter with Eli Sazakovich from the Field Museum. And we've had other conversations about needing to do a write-up, because there's been just a couple of museums and other institutions who've really been working on rematriating seeds. So thinking about what have the techniques been, the paths by which people have done that, whether it's through repatriation or through deaccessioning, or through, in the case of the Field Museum, we filled out a destructive analysis form, and that's how we were able to take seeds out of the collection and give them back to the community. So there are ways that I think sometimes the institutions are like, oh, this is a great idea in theory, but museums especially are set up as sort of this one-way process, right? Like, it's not that easy. It's much easier to get things into the museum than it is to get things out afterwards. And so, we are working on writing up something to provide that kind of guidance for people in museums to say, okay, here's how it's been done. Doug sent me a question about turning the tables on seed companies by bringing them to court for crossbreeding their corn to our traditional seeds, rather than them trying to own ours. The problem is agro industry has a lot of lawyers and a lot of money, and often communities don't have either of those things. So I think that's the challenge. And especially in that case, I think you would have to prove ownership over traditional seeds in order to then sue somebody else for crossbreeding those seeds. So I think that's where it could get challenging in trying to use the colonizers' courts against them. The system's not set up that way, unfortunately. But thank you, Doug, for your question.
The second part of Rebecca's question was, can growing and telling my own seed stories, which are settler seed stories, linked to seed sovereignty in my community?
Yeah, I think everybody should, to the extent that you're able, grow seeds and develop a relationship with seeds, and with the history of those seeds. So there've been, a number of other projects that people have written about where people part of, for example, the African diaspora have developed organizations. When I was living in Providence, the African Alliance developed gardens for people, especially women who were really missing the produce that they had access to in Africa that they did not in Providence, to be able to grow things there and to be able to trade seeds. People all over the world had histories of farming at one point or another. And I think, reconnecting with those seeds and developing, within your own community, wherever that is, whomever comprises that community, a network to be able to exchange seeds among each other, does contribute to seed sovereignty in your community, because then you're relying on each other for your seed stock for each year, rather than relying on a catalog that could disappear or a system that could collapse.
In connection to the patenting question that Paula previously asked, says, asks, what do you think about the idea of seeds as common good of the humanity?
I'm scrolling down trying to find that. Seeds as the common good of the humanity.
Such as perhaps as in the predominantly white food justice work, it's usually, I think this is my observation, I see that using seeds as a to feed to end the world hunger and such, and then using that kind of discourse is commonly something that I also come across, perhaps that connects to that, as an excuse to, especially seed companies. Certain seed companies do that, in my observation, collecting seeds from war zones and such. So it's sort of a, I guess, savior complex. Perhaps, I don't know if this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue with common good of the humanity. And this is, people approach kind of harvesting traditional environmental knowledge from communities sometimes in this way, because we have to like save the whole planet from global warming. So quick, give us your knowledge so we can fix that. Or the way people sometimes approach ethnobotanical, ethnopharmacological projects, like, okay, we need to go down to the Amazon and learn about all of their traditional plant medicine so we can create these drugs because the world needs to get rid of cancer. But I think oftentimes that philosophy of like, this is for the good of humanity, then divorces that knowledge, that material, plant material, those seeds from the communities that developed and stewarded these things. And so I think that's where it sort of removes, it's kind of the exact opposite as Paolo mentions here of individual ownership as being like the whole world owns it. And I think there is an in-between stage where you can recognize that communities have stewarded this knowledge, this plant material, these seeds, and should be consulted in the use of those things.
If I can jump in just to explain my meaning, I was referring more to the cultural heritage, in the sense that there are tangible and intangible cultural heritage. Obviously, the tangible are the physical places like the Colosseum or like some, and there are the intangible. But yes, I do agree perfectly that the communities has to be asked whether they want or not. But since many communities are strongly against property, as you correctly and very well define, there might be that option of the common good of the humanity and cultural heritage, because they would protect from being stolen and patented by others if they are protected as common good, because they would not be able, the others, to patent them against their will. That was my meaning. I'm sorry if I intervene, but I wanted just to clarify.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Like there has been these ongoing conversations, like the Organic Seed Alliance has organized a few of these conversations to say, like Jack Kloppenberg's idea of the open source seed network. How can you document all of these different seeds that communities have as a way of, making it all out in the public so that people can't patent them. And, some people think that sounds okay. And other people are, not that eager. Native communities have suffered a lot of abuse over the years of people coming and documenting things that people didn't want documented, taking things that people didn't want taken. So sometimes the notion of, okay, let's just put everything out there for the whole world makes some people a bit uncomfortable. So that's sort of the challenge of the common good of humanity, everything out in the open. Haha, it's all public now, you can't patent it, but they're like, yeah, but now people know where to like come poking around looking for things.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's 3:10, and I think and I see that people are leaving messages, and for this, I agree that for this wonderful lecture, I'd like to extend thanks to you, Dr. Hoover, for this amazing content, giving us this amazing content in your busy schedule. And is there anything, final words that people like?
Yeah, thank you all for coming. A big sego to Stephen McCumber, who I see popped in there, as I mentioned, as one of our treasured seed stewards, and to the other excellent folks who popped in and said hello. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, and have a good day.
Yes.